Last year's AI for Good Global Summit was truly an inspiring event. Yet at times it seemed a bit naive, as techno-optimists would wax poetic about what would happen once we had agglomerated all the data, health and otherwise, of everyone in Africa or Asia, how we would be able to reduce poverty if we sicked deep learning algorithms on that data. And those particular ideas, I think, sent a shudder up and down those of us who had human rights backgrounds or were cognizant of the rights of people to be used without informed consent in research. And this is not a new problem. It's been a problem in public health all along. When is it appropriate to trade off human rights for major societal benefits? Most of us have concluded, looking back at history and man's inhumanity to mankind, that the opportunities for doing that are very few and far between. Now, a lot has gone down since that last year's meeting. We've witnessed the weaponization of AI, the use of AI to manipulate our behavior, suddenly bias in algorithms, or the lack of transparency in algorithmic analysis has come to the fore. There's an array of issues around data ownership, data rights, and the responsibility of those who control data to those of us whose data they control. So we perhaps aren't quite as subservient to the technological idealists as we might have been last year. And I think that in and of itself is good news. It's exemplified in a maturation of the second gathering already, that there's more focus on ways we need to protect each other, there's more focus on what can go wrong. And my primary question these days is how, as we're reaping the benefits of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, how are we going to also mitigate the risks and undesirable societal consequences? I'd like to leave you with a simple distinction during this talk. I'm going to make a distinction between outwardly turning AI for good and inwardly turning AI for good, and perhaps accentuate the latter a bit more than it will be in other presentations at the summit. So what I mean by outwardly turning AI for good is this focus on discrete benefits that can be accrued with specific applications. And that by far is and rightly should be the primary focus of this conference, particularly in our ability to come up with applications that will mitigate the lives of the many billions among us who are truly vulnerable in the way that most of us in this room are not. And I'd also like to suggest that in that area, perhaps some of the most powerful applications will be very simple ones, will not be these more complicated ideas that we are speculating about for the future. A few days ago, I met Rose Golinga. Rose has founded an insurance company called Pula. Now, Rose is a do-gooder who surprised herself when she founded this insurance company. And what she does is provide insurance to 611,000 tiny farmers in Africa. Now, these aren't people who normally got insurance, because just selling them the policy, let alone administering the policy when something went wrong, there was no business model for that. But what they came up with was that the policy itself would be packaged in each bag of seed and fertilizer purchased. And given the fact that cell phones are now ubiquitous, in fact, increasingly, we have people with cell phones who do not have electricity. They have these tiny little solar jerry-rigged solar factories that charge their phones for them, they made it possible to register that insurance policy directly from the cell phone. Now, if a drought should occur, again, they are not asking the people who registered those insurance policies to put a claim in. What they are doing is they're looking at satellite data, particularly of cloud formations, and they are analyzing that with deep learning algorithms, and they are deducing how much rainfall there will be over different parts of Africa. And if they deduce that there will not be sufficient rainfall for crop production in particular areas, they immediately send a message by cell phone to those farmers that says that, along with a certificate that says they can go back and get another bag of seed or another bag of fertilizer. A very small application, but one tremendously important when you think of the fact that actuarially once out of every 15 years there's crop failures across these regions. So this is one of my favorite examples of outwardly turning AI for good. And when I look at the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, I can see ways in which emerging technologies can help us meet every single one of them. I don't think technology alone is the solution to many of them, but it can certainly help us address them. And given the fact that artificial intelligence is touching nearly every facet of life, artificial intelligence itself may not be central to the solution of each of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it can probably help amplify the use of other technologies or bring efficiencies to bear that might not be there otherwise. But then I look at Sustainable Development Goal 8, decent work, the promise of decent work for everybody. And I look at Sustainable Development Goal 10, reduced inequality. So these are good examples of where tech progress may actually exacerbate the problem. We've all been hearing about technological unemployment. That was John Maynard Keynes's term for the long-standing Luddite fear that technology would rob more jobs than it creates. I'm among those who believe that we are already seeing a downward pressure on job creation and wage growth because of automation. And regardless of whether you think in the long run artificial intelligence will create more jobs than it robs, we're going to see major periods of disruption before that's realized. Reduced inequality. Well, that already came up in one of the last questions, so I think we all understand that that's deeply problematic. In fact, so problematic that economists are coming to understand that the tech economy is designed so that productivity growths flow more and more toward those of us who are the best off in the world, particularly the 1%, at least, as we like to metaphorically point to them. But it probably touches all of our lives in one form or another. And then I look at goals 1 and 2, no poverty and zero hunger. Well, the lack of work and inequality, who do they touch the most? They always touch the same most vulnerable segment of our populations. So the problems with goals 8 and 10 are that it's going to exacerbate our inability to meet goals 1 and 2. So we're confronted with this fundamental problem that in all areas, progress in artificial intelligence is not going to serve the sustainability goals. And furthermore, there are ways in which this progress will dehumanize people, rob people of meaning in their life, particularly if that meaning comes from jobs that they can no longer find, and interfere with basic human flourishing. So here's where I come to inwardly turning AI for good. Inwardly turning AI for good is about mitigating the harms, mitigating and attending to what can go wrong, and looking closely at the societal impacts of these technologies to be sure that we aren't taking our communities in directions that we really don't want to evolve in, that don't really have meaning for humans in the long run. Now, those harms come in many forms. There's system failures that are due to bad design, that are due to incompetence, that are due to underestimating the likelihood of low probability events that can have a large impact. There's the appropriation of these technologies by rogue actors and by elites for self-serving purposes. So our charge is to look at both sides of AI for good. And in attacking the second side, particularly we need to look at the ethical and governance concerns. Now, I don't really make a distinction between ethics and governance concerns because I'm not using the government word, I'm using governance. I'm using the word of how we bring appropriate oversight to the technologies we're developing, and how we, in that oversight, look for gaps and ways to address those gaps, and what are the best mechanisms for addressing those gaps. So those mechanisms might be technological solutionism, they might be better corporate oversight, they might be in other forms. So rather than go on, I just wanted to leave you with that, but let me just leave you again with the final point. Let's have a distinction on both sides of what AI for good means. Outwardly turning AI for good and inwardly turning AI for good. And if somebody else has got a better phrasing for making those distinctions, please let me know.